Okay, hello everyone. My name is Phil Simon. Andy, thank you for the nice introduction. This is my third OCLC event and arguably my most challenging because who here is a football fan? Keep them up if you play fantasy football. Okay, that's not too bad actually. But anyway, I'm here to talk about platforms and how it affects libraries. And we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, so feel free to save them. I think there's a question microphone. So I want to first start with an experiment. And as Catherine said, if you can make sure your phones are off, that'd be wonderful. If everyone could stand up for a second, that would be wonderful. Go ahead and take a seat if you use any products from Amazon. Buy Amazon.com, Kindle, anything? Okay. Next up, Apple. Any Apple products? Have a seat. Okay, for those of you standing, do you use Facebook? Ooh, we got to go down to Google. Okay, if you use Google, have a seat. Wow, we've got, everyone? I got everyone? Okay. I did this once in DC about a year ago, and there was actually one man standing after I did all four. And the question from the moderator was, which cave do you live in? And the interesting thing about these companies is that people use them not because they have to, but because they want to. Right? No one has to use, as some of you just proved by standing up, no one has to use Amazon, right? There are other ways to buy books online, right? They don't make the only e-reader, right? So what is it about these four companies that compels people to voluntarily use them? This is a lot different than, say, 15 years ago, right? When people used the software or the products of IBM or SAP or Oracle or Microsoft, right? You use them at work. Why? Well, not because you wanted to, but because you had to. And I think that that's a particularly interesting distinction because with libraries, just in general, this isn't 20 years ago, right? You would hope that people use libraries because they want to. You don't necessarily have to use them because they have to. So this whole notion of consumerized IT will hopefully run through my presentation today. So what is it about these companies? Could we actually dim the lights here as we did before because the font's not showing up so well? Is that possible? Okay. So around 16, 17 months ago, my third book, The New Small, had come out. And it's about 11 companies that basically no one had ever heard of. But these companies were using technologies in really interesting ways. And I said to myself, as an independent speaker, writer, consultant, if I had to work for a big company, which one would it be and why? And quickly said to myself, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. And it turned out that around that time, I started sort of playing around with the manuscript for what became the book that many of you have. And I came upon this quote from Eric Schmidt at the All Things D conference on May 31st of last year. And he said, it seems to me there are four companies that are exploiting platform strategies really well. Now at the time, Schmidt was the CEO of Google. Now he's chairman of the board. So I said to myself, you're onto something here. Make this a book. And I did. So Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, what is it about these companies? Now it's interesting to note here that in this talk, Schmidt leaves out Microsoft, right? Which is not a coincidence. Again, we're talking about consumerized IT. We're talking about people who voluntarily use a lot of these platforms every day. Okay? Now, these companies Schmidt called the Gang of Four: Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google. And I argue in the book that they've done nothing less than redefine business. I am hard-pressed to find a startup these days that doesn't bill itself as some type of platform. And we're going to talk here about what we mean by platforms in a bit. By the way, for those of you taking notes, I believe that we're going to make the slides available afterward. So don't let me stop you from tweeting or taking notes, but we'll make the slides available. And I'd argue that the platform for these companies and for others that I talk about in the book is actually a fundamentally new business model. I'm going to talk about ecosystems. I'm going to talk about how I can have this sort of multi-directional relationship with a company like Amazon. I buy products from it, but maybe I refer people to it, and maybe I sell my books on it. It's not as simple as I'm just a customer. I actually can be a vendor or a partner. Okay? So they've ushered into this new age, which I term the age of the platform. Right? And in today's talk, I'm going to contrast certain aspects of sort of the pre-platform age with the current age in which we're living. But first, let's sort of get to the elephant in the room. What do we mean by a platform? It's, to me, become this really bastardized term. When people talk about Netflix, for example, and I have nothing against the company, I actually like Netflix. Netflix isn't a true platform. What can I build on top of Netflix? Nothing. right? Does Netflix have an open API, right? Application programming interface? No, right? Now there are reasons for that, but Netflix isn't a real platform, right? You can't just call something a platform and make it a platform. Now, first up, little p versus big P. This notion of a platform with a little p really has been with us for a long time, right? You're talking about operating systems or maybe telephone lines. So those little p platforms have been with us for a bit. But I'm really talking here in the book about a fundamentally new business model, platform with a big P. And in that business model, it's not just a gang of four, right? We're talking about, in the book, I talk about Twitter and LinkedIn and WordPress, right? Emerging platforms. Kickstarter. Anyone heard of Kickstarter, online funding platform? Or Udemy. Udemy is a fascinating site. I've created a couple of courses on Udemy, so I can make money on top of it. I wouldn't make money without Udemy, right? But now I can make money off of it through my courses when people buy them. And with a platform, this gets into this notion of integrated planks, products, apps, features, and services. Yes, for example, Google still makes 90% of its revenue through traditional search, but Google is launching into other areas, right? Android, YouTube, we'll talk about some more. So we're talking about not just doing one thing. Same thing with Amazon, right? When Bezos started the company in 1995, it was just about selling books online. Well, Amazon does so much more than that. Just as an example, last year, Amazon made about $850 million in essentially pure profit from selling basically cloud services to businesses, right? That's not really what a bookstore does, okay? So it's this platform thinking of not just doing one thing. It's this sort of rejection of the GE model of only doing one thing really, really well. That doesn't mean that Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google don't do things really, really well. It's just that they don't only do one thing. Sort of part and parcel to this notion of a platform as a business model is the ecosystem. And I'll use myself as an example. When my third book came out, I worked with a company to develop an app, which right now is just for iOS and you can download for free, hint. But when people would buy it, right, when it wasn't free, then I could make money off of the Apple platform, right? So Apple would take a 30% cut and I would get 70%, right? And that 70-30 split is actually very similar. So it's, again, I'm not a development company, right? I'm more technical than the average person, but I don't develop apps in my spare time. So how can I make money off of Amazon or Apple or Facebook or Google? It's because of ecosystems. It's because of people like, say, Amanda Hawking. Anyone ever heard of her? She's written, for those of you who don't know, sort of became a bit of a rock star. And she had written and published through Amazon's Kindle Direct program these short Twilight-type teen vampire ebooks and charged, I think, 99 cents for them. And over the course of 5 years, she made something like $1 million off of Amazon. Now, if you're a traditional publisher, wouldn't you want to sign up somebody who has that kind of following? So she wound up cashing in for a 4-book, $2 million deal with, I believe it was St. Martin's Press a couple years ago. That's the example of an ecosystem in action, right? Or if you look at Apple with Angry Birds, right? Jobs was a smart guy, but you can't tell me that he said, why don't we launch the App Store and Angry Birds will be downloaded 400 million times. Right? You can't possibly predict that. So ecosystems let regular people make money off of platforms. Okay? Now, I talked before about Google. And when Larry and Sergey came along in 1998, they really disrupted search, right? Who remembers search in 1997? Show of hands, right? It was terrible, right? you would get completely irrelevant information back. So Larry and Sergey come along and they revolutionized search, right? It was much better than AltaVista and Lycos, okay? So why change, right? Google still makes a ton of money off of search. Google still owns something like 68% of the US search market. That's a pretty good number, right? It's twice as big as everybody else combined. So why mess around with YouTube and why buy Motorola for $12.5 billion, right? Why Blogger and Gmail and all these other things? Well, because they're trying to build a true platform, okay? And as I argue in the book, even if you're really good at doing something, that something can be disintermediated, and then what do you do? How do you survive? Right? They understand this notion of a book by Clayton Christensen called The Innovator's Dilemma. Anyone ever heard of that book? Right. So many companies have refused to embrace the future. They've clung to the past, and as a result, they became irrelevant. I believe that it was 1976 that Kodak invented digital film. Kodak now has declared bankruptcy. They're suing Apple. They're trying to sell off their patents. Kodak will be no more. It's just a matter of time, despite the fact that they had unlocked the secret to digital film. Why? Innovator's dilemma. Well, to their credit, the leaders of the Gang of Four understand this problem, and you could be cannibalized very quickly. Anyone ever read the Steve Jobs biography by Isaacson? Okay. Fantastic book. You could do a lot worse than reading that book. And one of my favorite quotes in that text is from Jobs saying, your business is going to be cannibalized. The only question is who's going to do it, you or your competition. At very high levels at these companies, the Gang of Four understand this. Okay? Contrast that with, say, Microsoft, the company that for years and years has tried to cram everything into arguably its two most valuable franchises, Office and Windows. Okay? They're afraid to get away from that because those are both multi-billion-dollar businesses. Right? In fact, there was a great article on CNET I read about 6 months ago, going back to 2010 or so, in which there were a couple of really smart product leads at Microsoft working on a next generation tablet, right? This was even before the iPad had come out. And it got to the highest levels of the organization, and according to the article, Ballmer asked one simple question: does this help Windows and Office? And the developers said no. The project was dead. A couple months later, these two developers left the company. So here now Microsoft's trying to get back into it with the service, but you can understand the difficulty that companies and organizations have embracing the future. Okay, and I think that's something that a lot of libraries have to face as well. So it's tough to get away from this mindset of, well, this is our business, right? Very narrow sort of focus. So we know that Google wanted to become a platform, right? How? Well, Google added, to use my own terminology, different planks. Okay, we're talking here about Gmail and Maps and Docs and Plus and Android and all of these different things. So I would argue, and I make this point in, I think it's chapter 6 of the book, that if I could only use one site on the internet, it would probably be Google, because I could watch videos, right, with YouTube. I could be productive with Google Docs. Be a little bit compromised because a lot of times you're Googling other sites, but you understand what I'm saying. I could survive just on the Google platform, okay? So this is this notion of a platform as a business model, right? And it's funny, there was this whole ruckus back in January when Google announced that it was changing its privacy policy and enforcing a consistent one across all of its different products. In other words, if you were watching YouTube videos on one of my favorite shows, Arrested Development, if you haven't seen it, check it out, it's hysterical, you actually may see ads in Gmail related to buying an Arrested Development t-shirt. And some people said, well, you know, this is ridiculous, this is an invasion of my privacy. And Google wasn't giving people a choice to opt out, although I would argue, as I said before, we all have the choice to opt out. Don't use it, right? Google's not the only search engine, right? You want to watch videos online, go to Hulu, right? There are other ways to do everything. But again, Google was trying to have a consistent experience across the different planks in its platform. So that's the sort of platform thinking that I'm talking about. And Google, along with Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google, have some things in common here. They frequently add planks to their platforms. I think it was 7, 8 months ago that before going public, Facebook spent $1 billion on Instagram, right? Why? 30 million users. Okay, they're adding a plank. Some people said that that was crazy. Well, maybe, maybe not. But in 2007, Google paid $1.65 billion for YouTube, and people said, you guys are crazy. Well, now, YouTube is actually competing with Netflix. YouTube is going to be a source not just for dancing cats or some of those other videos, but for original content. Jay-Z, Madonna, and Ashton Kutcher all inked deals to provide original content for YouTube. And Google's also starting to monetize watching videos through the ads that you see, right? So they're buying planks and then they're figuring out what to do with them later. And sometimes these planks don't work. But again, you have to experiment in the age of the platform. There's no guarantee that an acquisition is going to work. Okay. Next up, as I said, these are mostly consumer-oriented products, and that allows for this sort of viral marketing to take place. I'm an iPhone guy. One of my favorite questions when I see another iPhone user is, what's your favorite app? Because I want to learn what am I missing, right? And there's this sense of virality that takes place. You see someone with the latest Kindle, right? You see someone with an iPad or an iPod, right? That's happening at these massive scales. It's happening when people are on subways and planes and buses. So they're more consumer-oriented. People use these platforms not because they have to, but because they want to. there's this notion of the consumerization of IT. Now, many times people have more powerful computers in the form of smartphones on their hips than they did, say, 10 years ago when they went into their office. Okay? And they're all rooted in emerging technologies. Now, 3 of the gang of 4 are actually sort of internet or cloud native. Right? Apple, which was formed in, I believe, legally 76, was the one company that had to kind of get away from legacy technologies. Right? Early on, Amazon, Apple, Facebook all understood that the internet mattered. So it's very hard to be an effective platform if you kind of dismiss mobility, right? You don't think apps matter, right? You think the cloud is nonsense, right? You don't think that social technologies matter. I don't know too many companies that have really embraced platform thinking that are not on board with these emerging technologies. And there's one more thing, to paraphrase from Steve Jobs, iconic leaders. Right? Each company got to these points through their leaders. Something to be said for the single leader kind of theory. Google's a little different because it was Larry and Sergey, but their influence is still felt at Apple. In fact, this is actually taken from the Fast Company cover a few weeks ago. So anyway, we can tweak the lights, by the way. I see a few people squinting. If not, it's not a big deal. Hopefully I'm the focus, not the slides. But it's very difficult to transplant an external leader into a company and save it. Right? Look at Yahoo. We're talking about, what, 5 CEOs in the last 5 years? HP is an even bigger disaster. Right? It's because every CEO comes in and has a different plan, and that person doesn't necessarily have the company in his or her DNA. Right? Now, it's important. Mark Zuckerberg could have sold out years ago for a ton of money, but he's gone on record saying that I don't want to leave Facebook. I don't think I'll ever have an idea as good again. So he cares a lot about the company. That's why before Facebook went public, he had it written in that he would own 57% of the voting rights of the company. So you can't get anything past Facebook without going through Mark. Okay? That doesn't mean that he's perfect. It just means that you can't take, say, Rupert Murdoch and put him in charge of MySpace, and all of a sudden MySpace is the place to be. Nothing against Rupert Murdoch, but would anyone really confuse him with a tech visionary like Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos? Right? These people live and breathe their company. Okay. Now, I want to talk about how the Gang of 4 has really built their platforms as it pertains to, say, libraries, because I think there are a lot of valuable lessons here for libraries. There's no one right way to build a platform. Apple did not create the first MP3 player, right? Anyone remember the Rio player in 98 or 99? Okay, some of you might have had one. Apple came along and said, we're going to make the simplest thing that basically anybody can use without a training manual. And oh, by the way, getting back to this notion of ecosystem, what good is an MP3 player if you can't easily add a wide variety of songs to it? Same thing with Jeff Bezos and the Kindle e-reader. In 2006, Sony actually put one out. But you had to have a PhD in computer science to figure out how to get one of the few books on there. Right? There's something to be said for one click and being able to buy any book you want and easily get it on your device. Why? Again, consumerization of IT. Right? We spend a lot of time at work trying to navigate a labyrinth of systems and making things work. Right? We don't want to do that when we're at home. Right? We just want to click and buy. Okay? So there is no one right way. Facebook was not the first social network. Friendster, MySpace, Classmates.com. Okay? Amazon is almost the exception that proves the rule. Amazon actually was the first online bookstore, and this is absolutely astonishing. I discovered this researching the book. Guess what year Borders actually launched an online store? Anyone, take a guess.
2005?
Keep going.
2007?
2009. And now Borders, a couple of months ago, filed for bankruptcy. So to me, the question is not, why did Borders go bankrupt? The question to me is, why did it take so long? Right? Think about it. You saw this coming, it's like Kodak, years and years ahead of time. Amazon was obviously doing very well selling books. So again, innovator's dilemma. Here's a company that just said, it's not in our DNA. What, did they think the internet was going away? So again, you have to disrupt your own business because that's just the time, those are the times that we live in. Scale, experimentation, and speed are critical. If you look at, say, Twitter, which is one of the examples that I use in the back of the book about emerging platforms, around 2009, Twitter was starting to blow up. And Twitter, not to get too technical here, had been built on this open sort of database framework called Ruby on Rails. Some of you may have heard of it. Make a long story short, Ruby on Rails wasn't meant to handle 65,000 tweets a minute like what happened on Monday night with the Packers game and the Seahawks, right? And as a result, you know the blue fail whale on Twitter that some of you still may see? Okay, that was a lot more frequent back when they were on Ruby on Rails. So the guys from Twitter had invented this really interesting utility and service that tons of people were using, right? So the question became, it's starting to break, what do we do? Do we basically sell out to a company like Google, cash in, do something else, retire early? Or do we blow up the sort of back end of the system to build something that actually can scale? Well, Twitter chose the latter, and they ripped out their internal systems and they put in something called Scale-Up that actually is better equipped to handle, I think it's something like 350 million tweets a day, and that number keeps going up. So scale and speed are all really critical. When Facebook had the opportunity to buy Instagram, it's a little bit unfair to compare it because back then I think the price was $1 billion and now it's actually gone down because there's a combination of cash and stock, and Facebook stock has actually dropped by 50%. But Instagram founders and Zuckerberg sat down and basically banged out that deal over a weekend. Okay, so speed is essential. Adding new and popular planks. Again, these opportunities come up and you have to jump at them. And sometimes you wind up possibly overpaying, but you just don't know. There was a really fascinating interview a couple of weeks ago on the show called Bloomberg West, which they had on the head of Google acquisitions, right, a VP. And they were talking about budgets. I said, what's your budget for acquisitions? He goes, we have none. Why? Well, think about how most people spend their budgets. If you have a minimum, you better spend that, right? If you have $1 million budget and you only spend $900,000, well, what do you think you're going to get next year? So there's this pressure to spend it, use it, or lose it, okay? So there's no minimum because it's hard to imagine Google with a $12.5 billion budget to buy Motorola Mobility, right? So they take each deal on sort of a case-by-case basis, right? Because they have to add these planks. Next up, cross-pollination. Right? Google has an official Twitter feed. Okay? Amazon has an official YouTube channel. Right? You think that if you go to, you might have seen this. Anyone ever do a book review on Amazon? Okay. Only one, really? Thank you. And you'll see the icons there. Share on Facebook or tweet this review. Okay, that's designed because Amazon, even though I would argue that reviews are inherently social, right? Amazon is not a social networking company, but they're taking advantage of existing platforms. Right? So I don't, for the most part, see a need to reinvent the wheel. Okay? It would be silly for me not to put this talk up on YouTube. Right? Now, will it be on my site? Sure. Do I have a Vimeo channel that lets me do some extra things? Absolutely. But people are watching an astonishing number of videos on YouTube every day. Why not throw one out there? Because as a speaker, an author, and a writer, someone notices, and just like Andy says, we got to get this guy in here. It would be silly for me not to do that. So they intelligently use other platforms as planks in their own. Now, as I said, this notion of a platform isn't new. And going back, say, 15 years ago, when I wrote my, was working on the content that would ultimately sort of inform my first book, there certainly were platforms, right? If you talk about the enterprise space, Oracle, SAP, PeopleSoft, but they were tended to be really closed systems with limited partnership. If you wanted to be a Microsoft partner, well, there wasn't an app store per se, okay? There was a formal legal process. I knew partners of Oracle, and I said, talk to me about being a partner, and they would, it's crazy. Right? That's a lot different now, right? As I said, I am an Apple partner because I sell an app on the store, right? I'm arguably an Amazon partner or vendor because I sell my books on Amazon. Well, now, they're much more open systems. The partnerships are much more collaborative and things can come about very, very quickly, okay? It's just a much more open, faster time, right? So there's this fundamental difference here. The ecosystems are much broader. Before I was talking about WordPress as a platform. For those of you who don't know, WordPress is a content management system used by 650 million people. It powers sites like Huffington Post, New York Times, and even personal sites like my own. That is an ecosystem. There are thousands of developers who create custom WordPress sites. Okay? They create extensions or plugins or themes, or they do consulting and setup and design work. That is an ecosystem. So I'm focusing on the gang of four, but it doesn't mean that you have to have billions of dollars in revenue or thousands of employees. Andy talked before about, and this is in the first part of the book, how I personally have embraced platform thinking. I don't want to hear that we're not big enough to go for a platform, right? I don't buy it, because I've done it. In 2008, when I was on these kinds of consulting projects, I said to myself, and I had a great year in 2008 as the economy was tanking, said, fast forward 5 years. Do you want to continue to do this kind of work, and do you think this kind of work will be available? And in both cases, the answer was no. So over the last 4 years, I've blown up that line of business. I no longer do that kind of consulting for the most part. It's barely a line item on my financial statements. I started writing books. I started doing speaking. I started doing paid writing and other kinds of things. So this notion of a platform, I think, can be applied to much smaller companies because I've done it. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about sort of the pre-platform world and the post-platform world. Right? Again, primarily going back, say, 10, 15 years, people use these platforms at work. Right? You're in office and you were using a single PC. Right? This was before really smartphones and tablets. Well, now, you still will use, I would argue, you Google things when you're at work, right? Some companies block you for using Facebook, but I would argue that you can make a clear case that there's a business need. You ever hear of a notion of a community manager? Some companies will employ them. Basically, people who spend all day paying attention to what's going on Twitter and tweeting. And some people go, God, I want that job. But there's actually a business point to it. Okay? So it's much more consumer-oriented right now. And it isn't just about one device, right? In fact, this is an astonishing number. Microsoft Windows used to power something like 97% of all devices connected to the internet. Take a guess on what percentage of devices now run some version of Windows connected to the internet. Anyone?
35.
I heard 35, and you're very close, but there was a question about phones?
Do I get to include phones?
You better include phones. You better, yeah. It's around 26%. So think about that shift. Even though most people here, even though I see some Macs, at their jobs are probably, for different reasons, connecting through Windows and a proper PC, we are not just connecting to the internet through computers. Okay? So it really deals with this explosion of mobility and the consumerization of IT. Again, with ecosystems, they tended to be very stable. I know companies that were Microsoft or Oracle partners for 15 years. Okay? And again, there's an entire process there. The companies who want to more tightly control their ecosystems. Right? Strategic partners. Now you have Microsoft partners that are still sort of big companies, but then you have other development firms or other individuals like me that make their money off of these platforms. Okay? And these partnerships can change very quickly. A couple of months ago, Twitter kind of clamped down on its APIs and said we don't really want people changing the experience. We want there to be a standard sort of Twitter client. And they told LinkedIn, you're not going to be able to post feeds from Twitter now. So that was done. That happened very quickly. Okay? So things happen a lot faster than they did 10, 15 years ago. This gets into this notion, and I could talk for hours about this, about frenemies and coopetition. And I'll give two examples. One we'll talk about later with Zynga. But has anyone heard of a company called StockTwits? Okay, this is fascinating. The beauty of Twitter is that when Jack and Biz and Evan created the company, they didn't know what they created, right? They just said, this has potential. We don't know what it is yet, right? And they looked to the ecosystem and said, what would make it better? So if you look at hashtags, that was not someone in a corner office going, I think we should have hashtags. Hashtags actually came organically. It came from the bottom up. Ditto the retweet button. Okay, ditto, anyone ever heard of the hashtag Follow Friday or FF? So you want to give a shout out to your friends on Twitter, you do FF, hashtag, and then somebody. Those all came from the community. So a couple years ago, I forget the guy's name, but the guy started a company called StockTwits. And instead of the hashtag for Follow Friday or Breaking Bad or whatever, you would have a $ then followed by MSFT for Microsoft or AAPL for Apple, right? Or FB for Facebook. And when you clicked on that cash tag with a C, it would bring up stock information, right? Pretty neat. This guy built a business over it. He built a business on top of the Twitter platform. So the guys from Twitter take a look at it and go, good idea, we're doing it. So if you read this guy's post, and if you go to the ageoftheplatform.com, type in stock twits, I blogged about it and they got the links there and all that. This guy was irate, right? And think about it. I understood his frustration, but his company never even would have existed without Twitter. So there's this very sort of uncomfortable area for a lot of people. Well, how do I know if I build something, then it just won't be cannibalized, right? I build a cool game on top of Facebook, and Facebook goes, oh yeah, we're going to add something like that. So it's very much about being uncomfortable. There isn't necessarily this 5-point plan. One of my favorite quotes in the book comes from Jerry Brown, who was the former governor of California. And he said, everyone likes to plan because no one has to do anything. That's a bit of a simplification, but you can't tell me that your corporate 5-year, your organizational 5 or 10-year plan accounted for the Arab Spring. Who saw that coming? Nobody. So you have to get comfortable with unpredictability. Now, with the collaboration, it's very, I think, different. There wasn't necessarily before the same opportunity for mutual gain, right? We saw Microsoft as an example, as a company that was very, very tough with its partners, right? There were a lot of application developers back then who were just really frustrated with them because it was Microsoft's way or the highway. Now, that hasn't totally been eliminated, but I talked before about the 70-30 split, right? So I've always said that I'd rather make 70% of something than 100% of nothing, right? Can I build my own bookstore online, right? Go to a site like elance.com, spend $30,000, say, hey, you know what? I want to sell my books on your site. I could, right? And I could keep all of it. I wouldn't have to kick whatever 30% to Amazon. I could do that, but why would I want to, right? Amazon. If you look at the rankings, it's actually kind of stunning. People trust Amazon among the gang of four as much. They don't trust Facebook as much. Amazon has something like 350 or 400 million credit card numbers. Amazon could tell you exactly who its customers are and what they bought. That's why anyone, if you have bought a book from Amazon, you'll get an email. Customers who bought X like Y. That's actually the program there. If X, then Y. And they use this technology called collaborative filtering that actually Netflix uses as well. So if your favorite movie, my favorite movies are the Memento and The Usual Suspects. They hurt your brain, right? They don't go in order. So they'll recommend movies to me, right, based on that. They use the same kind of technology there. So they want to work with you. If I sell my app on the App Store and it's for small business productivity, then maybe it's going to recommend other apps to other people, right? So they want to work with you. And for me, it's worth kicking 30% to Amazon because you might be interested in buying my book, but if you have to give your credit card to a site and you're not quite familiar with them, why would you bother? Okay? So they take advantage of this. You're cooperating with Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. Google, same thing with AdSense, right? You can make money on your site. Google's letting individual companies and sites make money off of their platform. Okay? It's less about top-down, and in many ways, it's more about bottom-up. Technology, then and now. The technology 15 years ago tended to be mostly closed source or proprietary. Sometimes you could license it, was very expensive. These days, the technology is so cheap. Right? If you want to use the same technology behind Netflix, you can. And there are tens of thousands of small businesses that use Amazon's elastic cloud to power their business, which is basically what Netflix uses, right? So when they had their cloud outage, that affected Netflix. It's funny, people don't realize that they're actually already using cloud computing, but they are, okay? So we're seeing here software development kits and APIs, right? They want you to build on top of their platforms, right? Now they may chop off their API, which gets into that risk thing that I was talking about, but again, they're trying to democratize it as much as possible. They want there to be 650,000 apps in the App Store because there's going to be a hit, right? And if you're Apple, think about the brilliance of that. You don't have to spend the money developing an Apple-sanctioned app that may not be very good, right? Which, by the way, kind of reminds me of the Maps debacle, right? So there was a case of Apple overreaching. And to their credit, Cook was very quick to realize, yeah, we screwed up. In fact, issued a formal apology. So the technology now is a lot cheaper, it's a lot more powerful, and it's been democratized, which has a huge impact on innovation, right? It's less about top-down, right? And it's much more about bottom-up. And things can happen so quickly. I don't know how long it took Instagram to reach 30 million users, but I'll bet you a Coke that it wasn't more than 18 months. That's a phenomenal rate, okay? And think about this viral notion of it, right? Do you really want to get spam from a company? Hey, check out this, that, and the other thing. No. But if you're using an iPhone and I see what kind of app you're using, or I don't even ask, you tell me, Phil, you got to check this out, right? I'm more likely to listen to word of mouth, and this thing happens virally, right? We don't know what's going to explode on Twitter or YouTube. There was a really interesting TED Talk a couple of months ago I saw about videos going viral. And there's basically no way to predict it. But they had graphs, right? You see 8 views a day, 10 views a day, 6 views a day. Next day, 4 million views. Why? Because a comedian mentioned it on a show. So there's no way for you to predict this type of thing. And that's arguably, it makes people uncomfortable, but it's arguably a good thing, right? It happens very fast. This external innovation really stems from these ecosystems. You have many, many smart people out there using these open APIs, using these software development kits or SDKs, and they're creating things that no one can possibly imagine. And is anyone familiar with this notion of a long tail? All right, great book by Chris Anderson, one of the few business books that I read twice. So there will be a few hits, but there is this place in an app store or on Amazon.com in which books can sell 5 or 10 copies a year, right? Because Amazon can ship basically anywhere. So it isn't necessarily about getting the big hit. It's great if the hit happens, but I don't think that you can necessarily predict it, okay? So you want to take advantage of the developers who submit the apps, and then, in the case of Apple, there's an approval process, right? Apple has said it's not a totally open platform, right? We don't want there to be objectionable content, right? No pornography, things like that. If a company violates Apple's terms of service, like Path did, which is a social network, basically reading people's email addresses from their contact lists, Apple's going to say once they find out, we don't like that, right? We're chopping you off. So you want this innovation to come from these different sources. One of my favorite stories is on a slide in it today, but there's a band called Dream Theater, one of my favorite bands, and the keyboardist is a man by the name of Jordan Rudess. Nice man, I met him a couple times. I actually quote him in the book. And even though he's a classically trained pianist who went to Juilliard when he was 9, I talked to his wife once, and he said, yeah, we have this incredibly beautiful Steinway piano in our home, but this guy just messes around with electronic stuff. So he's created apps for iOS and now for Android. So when he's at a Dream Theater concert playing for 5,000 people, when he's not playing keyboards or piano or one of other 100 different instruments, he's playing his iPad, okay? So he's basically giving a product demo to 5,000 people who, many of whom are musicians, and with a couple of clicks, they can buy his app. Okay, so that's a really interesting example, I talked about Amanda Hawking before, of innovation in action, right? Now, he's making money for himself, but he's also making money for Apple, right? It isn't necessarily just about a company's R&D department, okay? Now, anyone could say, I want to build a platform, but you have to provide these incentives. I was laughing recently when Research in Motion, RIM, makers of the BlackBerry, was trying to incentivize developers because no one really develops a lot of apps these days for BlackBerries, right? Any show of hands, who here has a BlackBerry? Okay? 4 people, 5 people. My hunch is that 4 or 5 years ago, it would have been probably 60, 70% of people, right? So if you're a developer, do you really want to spend the time, money, and effort building an app on a BlackBerry? I could make the argument that you would because the bar is kind of low, but I don't know how long RIM will still be around. So RIM, I actually give them credit for this, they were offering something like 10 grand to pay you to develop an app. Okay? So you have to give the partners incentives, but ideally if you're a developer, you want your app to go viral. And without getting myself in trouble, no disrespect to the people who have BlackBerries, let me ask you, for the 5 people who have BlackBerries, will your next phone be a BlackBerry?
No.
Okay, so you have to give them incentives, but you also have to give them tools, right? So I'm talking about these SDKs, right? I'm talking about APIs, right? And I'm talking about having your data in decent shape. I did some consulting for a large financial institution about 6 months ago, and they saw the book, they brought me in, blah, blah, blah. Said, well, we have APIs, right? Their data was in such a mess that if I were a developer, it would take me so long to figure it out that I don't even know if I'd want to develop something for it, okay? That gets into sort of little p territory, right? It's hard to embrace the platform as a business model if you don't understand your users. As I said, Amazon can produce a quick list of hundreds of millions of customers. When I moved about a year and change ago from New Jersey to Las Vegas, I updated my information because I wanted Amazon to send me stuff, right, accurately. So are you giving people the incentives to maintain their own stuff, right? If you're an app developer, you want to be contemporary, right? You want to be doing the most recent things. And again, open APIs, application programming interfaces, basically will connect sources of data with machines, right? So there could be a Twitter API, Google Maps API, Google Plus API, et cetera, et cetera. And with the SDKs, the software development kits, they make it easy. And not even just for techies. I was reading an article on CNET a couple months ago about a 7-year-old kid in China who developed an app. Wow. There was a TED Talk from a 12-year-old out of the United States who talked about how he begged and pleaded with his parents, right? Not for a video game, but for $99. Why? Because that's how much Apple charges to be registered to put apps in. And he developed 2 apps and he wanted to do more. Amazing, right? We're talking about ideas a 12-year-old had that probably this person sitting in the senior office may not. Now, maybe those ideas aren't very good. But again, democratization of the technology, using the ecosystems. Now, we'll talk a little bit about Zynga, and then we're going to have some time for questions here. Zynga is an interesting case study because the Facebook platform gave birth to, at one point, a $1 billion company. And at one point, talking about this notion of frenemies and competition, Facebook was responsible for 90% of Zynga's revenue, and Zynga was responsible for 10% of a much larger number, right, of Facebook's revenue. Now, Zynga's stock is actually a lot like BlackBerry's these days, and who knows if Zynga is going to be around. The point here is that Facebook gave rise to a separate company, but Zynga and Mark Pincus, the founder you see pictured here, understood the inherent risk of only playing on one platform. Zynga wants people to go to Zynga.com and play games. Zynga wants people to go to Google Plus and play games. So you're trying to exist on multiple platforms. That's what I'm talking about here with the platform as a business model. One thing that these companies have in common is this notion of a paramount importance of the ease of use, right? Again, we don't want things to be complicated, right? Imagine just going to YouTube and having a separate sign-on that you did for Gmail or for Blogger, okay? That would be terrible, right? Instead, when you sign into Google, right, I can see all of my news stories in Google Reader. I can see all of my videos for YouTube. Again, ease of use is paramount here. And that isn't just within a platform. Think about what Facebook did with Facebook Connect, or you ever see those sign in with Twitter, sign in with LinkedIn. What are those platforms doing? Well, they're trying to be sticky. They're trying to make it easy for you to register for other sites. Okay. Now, some people aren't comfortable with that, right? Because you're basically checking a box that lets them access your data. And if you have an issue with that, I can't argue with you. But they're talking about making it as easy as possible to use their platforms, which I think gets into something that Catherine had mentioned along with the knowledge bases. We see some different organizations creating their own sort of separate data entities or knowledge bases when in fact having one that everybody could use might make more sense. Okay, so why not sort of take advantage of, perfect example, Amazon, right? If you buy a Kindle in the mail and you type in your username and your password, that's all you have to do. It knows what you purchased. So if it's an upgrade from a previous Kindle, right, when you get a new iPhone, you type in your Apple ID. Again, user experience, ease of use. The goal here is ultimately to eliminate friction, right? When I gave the talk last week, I gave this example from the other Chris Anderson book. He actually has 3 out now, but his second book is called Free, The Future of a Radical Price. And Amazon, I want to say 8-9 years ago, did an experiment. Said, we want to do free shipping for a day in the UK, in Europe. And because of some obscure French law, they couldn't charge nothing. They had to charge something, the equivalent of 1 penny in the US. I forget what that is, but it was something, right? It was a non-zero number. As a result, in France, the number of orders was something like 60% lower than it was in a comparable market like England, all because of just having something. Again, the objective here is to eliminate friction by focusing on as much as possible, seamless user experience, right? Imagine how annoyed you would be if you had to log into Facebook twice an hour, right? It kept having you re-authenticate. Now look, there's a fine line here. If I were to pick up that PC and log into Facebook, my account, it would tell me, right? Because I could be hacked, and I want to know that. So when I say frictionless, that might be overstating it a bit, because a little friction may be good, right? You can get a lot of trouble if you just let people sign in from whatever, and before you know it, people have gotten hacked, and then no one wants to use your platform anymore because it isn't secure. But again, you really want to make things as easy as possible, because let's face it, people are busy, right? We are bombarded as consumers with technology, right? No one wants to spend a lot of time figuring things out. Jobs got it right. People hate reading user manuals. Okay? So we're going to have some time for questions. But I mentioned before Facebook Connect, and I want to end here with implications for libraries. Okay? Based on my understanding of OCLC and doing a few talks here and talking to some of the people, I do think that it can lead and provide a shared infrastructure for its members. I don't think that it makes sense to consistently create the wheel and have a lot of competing products. Now, that doesn't mean that with Apple you don't have 20 apps that essentially do the same thing, right? That's true. But if you're Apple, I have one user ID when I log in, and Apple knows the songs, the movies, the TV shows, the apps that I have downloaded. Okay? And on the basis of that, it can make recommendations. If I had a separate Apple account for music that I did for movies, then Apple would be missing a major opportunity, because people who like maybe complex movies, right, might like complex music. And in my case, it's true. I love 17-minute songs. That's just me. People who like, say, Britney Spears might be more inclined to watch Jersey Shore. So building these separate sort of pieces of the infrastructure, not connecting them, I would argue doesn't make sense. I still think that it's about culture more than technology. The technology exists to do just about anything. And if you take a look, say, 10 years ago, if I were to have written this book, I would have written it about Yahoo, AOL, MySpace, okay? Those three companies probably. Well, those companies at the time had superior technology, but why are those companies essentially irrelevant, right? Or certainly much less relevant than they were 10 years ago, right? I mean, Yahoo, again, another example. Maybe Marissa Mayer can turn it around, but we're talking about a company that used to be the place to be. Now, not so sure. It's very tough to change the culture, even if you do have the technology. So getting people from a library's perspective of thinking about platforms and user experiences and getting out of their own comfort zones is certainly a challenge. I have very little doubt that doing all these things will make it easier, but not easy. So if you can get people to collaborate and to share information and kind of get out of their shells, I don't think that it guarantees anything. And there will always be those that are what they would call laggards, right? They don't like the new technology, right? They want to do things the way they've always been doing them. And I just don't see how that's possible. So we should have a decent amount of time for questions. And I think at around 3:15 I'll be signing copies of the book. But this is me. And if you have the microphone, we could take some questions.
Okay, sure. I was just kind of curious. Is the concept platforms that you're talking about, that might be analogous to what we saw in financial firms and manufacturing firms at the turn of the last century, where they were basically verticalizing? You know, a steel maker would buy the coke factories, they would buy the coal mines, and just integrate it from top to bottom. Is that?
Yes and no. I believe that to different extents, these platforms want to be as sticky as possible, and they want to add sort of these natural extensions. When I think about, though, those companies that got into vertical and horizontal integration, and I address this in chapter 2 of the book, I always think about monopolies and how most people hated monopolies, right? You didn't use steel companies or railroads or oil companies because you wanted to. You used it because it was part of doing business. You wouldn't find people, plenty of people don't like Apple. And Facebook, I think, was ranked as the 9th most hated company 2 years ago. So you have their detractors. But I generally think that I said, if you don't want to use Facebook, you don't have to use Facebook. If you were a business at the time that you were talking about, then how did you get around Standard Oil, right? So I tend not to view these companies as monopolies. it's funny because I think a lot of people think what you think. And some of the senior leadership at Microsoft recently has come out against Google as having a de facto monopoly in search, right? 68%. Does anyone find that a little ironic? A company that had been sued by not just the US, but the European Union for bundling IE with Windows. And does anyone think that it's easier to change search engines than it is to change operating systems? So I think there are some similarities, but to their credit, I don't think that Amazon is trying to do everything to everybody. In fact, there is this sort of focus at these companies around different product areas. When Larry Page, in I want to say late May of last year, took over for Schmidt as CEO, he found that Google was actually becoming a little bit too fragmented, right? Google had so many products, right? You know, everyone here knows about the 20% rule. Google engineers could spend one day a week doing whatever the heck they wanted. And while that resulted in innovations like Google News, it also resulted in a lack of focus. So Page came in and shut down products like Google Health and iGoogle and Google Squared, which is one of my favorites. It's actually in the book. It was kind of a neat technology. But there is this notion of trying to do different things, but I don't see, look what Apple just did with the latest version of iOS and iTunes. It got rid of Ping, and Ping was sort of this social light function, right? You could say, I like this song, and you could, in theory, find out about the band and concerts and make comments, et cetera. So Apple wasn't trying to be a social network company. In fact, I would argue, if you look at what Apple's done over the last 6 months, they've actually gotten into bed with Twitter and Facebook more, right, in terms of tighter integration, which is, I think it was Khrushchev who said, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So I think it's similar in some ways. There was another question?
Yeah, I had a question. Some of what you focused on, particularly with Google and with Amazon, is the kind of server-centric or web presence-centric nature of platforms. And I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on the importance of getting close to the user, like with Google Chrome and with the Amazon Kindle, and how important that is in a platform strategy.
I think it's essential. Jobs was notorious for not wanting to sell to CIOs. Why? Because they weren't the ultimate end users of the product, right? Ironically, with Apple, and we saw this with, I think it was Pfizer that had purchased, I think it was 30 or 70,000 iPads. Apple's actually penetrating the enterprise, despite the fact that historically it hasn't gone there. Well, why? Again, it's bottom up, it's not top down. I think the user experience is absolutely essential. And sort of related to that, it's impossible to make everybody happy, right? For those of you, show of hands, who uses Facebook? Keep them up if a GUI change or sort of a front end page has at one point made you angry, okay? I didn't see a lot of hands go down. In fact, I saw one come up. So you're never going to make everybody happy, and I think, and we talked about this at the last talk, this does have implications for OCLC members, right? You're always going to have people go, I don't like the new, I don't like timeline if you're Facebook, right? And it's ironic because you're seeing this sort of resistance pop up with Facebook and on Facebook groups. If Facebook makes a change, invariably there's a group, Facebook's new design sucks. Join the group. Right? So they're almost feeding their own resistance. But to their credit, Zuckerberg, and he takes a lot of heat, and he's not perfect, but when this guy was 21 years old, fascinating book on Facebook called The Facebook Effect by David Kirkpatrick. He talks about at age 21, Zuckerberg wasn't saying, I want to build a big company, I want to build a cool website, I want to get rich. He was talking about, I want to build a great platform. Who thinks like that? That's astonishing to me. So they know that they're not going to make everybody happy. There were tons of people who were outraged when Google announced its change in privacy policy and the fact that they couldn't opt out. But they understand that if you're trying to please everybody, then you're going to please nobody. Who's a football fan here? Show of hands. Okay, there's a saying in football that if you have two starting quarterbacks, you have none. These companies pick a direction and they go with it. And if they make a mistake like Apple did with Maps, or AntennaGate, or this thing with the EPEAT, there was an environmental group that they had left, and there was this outcry because a lot of people are vocal, and they think that Apple ought to be more sort of socially or environmentally responsible. The outcry was so loud that Apple did reverse course. But as a general rule, these companies aren't afraid to take bold and decisive steps, and I think that does have a lot of parallels for OCLC. Other questions? Yeah.
Where do you see students, like what, it seems seems like a different world is coming, so what skills or, I don't know. It's
I just want to refine your question. What skills if you're a child?
If you, yes, I mean, if you look the K-12 and then the university level. Because it seems like education is undergoing a sea change, but I'm not exactly sure where.
Well, education is being democratized as well. Who here has heard of Khan Academy? Show of hands. If you haven't, Google it. Microsoft and Google have all invested, I think, more than $1 billion each in online education. And this guy, I forget his first name, but his last name is Khan, K-H-A-N. And the impetus here, he's done TED Talks. He was on Charlie Rose. He's a fascinating guy. I think he's 35 or 36. He's a baby. And one of his cousins, I think in India, said, I'm having a hard time studying. So he literally just sat down and recorded a video of him doing algebra. And he put it on YouTube. And before we knew it, he had something like 10,000 views. So he did a few more and a few more. And now Khan Academy has, I think, 12 employees, but a ton of funding, and it is changing education. So, is that does to me reflect platform thinking. Now, that's not an open platform. I talked before about the site Udemy that lets people create their own courses, but that's for profit, right? They're letting me make money. If they take a cut as well, I think it's actually 30%. But even more broadly than that, there was this great scene I saw recently of a 3-year-old with a magazine. And the 3-year-old was going like this and couldn't fathom that the images didn't move. Or the same thing with a television. I've seen 4 or 5-year-olds touching a screen and crying because it didn't work. So Dan Tapscott wrote about this in Growing Up Digital. I really don't think that platforms are going anywhere because a lot of the resistance I see from people who are a bit more senior, I think will go away because some people have always grown up with the internet, right? But that doesn't mean that if you're quote unquote old, then you don't get it. I was in an Apple store about 2 months ago in Las Vegas, had a problem with my MacBook Pro, and this just put a smile on my face. I didn't ask how old she was, but if you haven't been to an Apple store, you know how they give classes? There was, I want to say, a 75-year-old woman taking an iPad course. How do you not just smile at that? Here's someone going, oh, this is cool, I want to learn about it. Right? So I think there are vast implications for education, and they're very disruptive, but now you'll be able to reach people you couldn't reach before. So, more questions? How are we doing on time? Good?
We still have about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Questions? Yes?
You gave us a kind of a list of implications for libraries. I'm wondering, what are the implications of the platform on large publishers? Do you have any advice for us?
Change or die, in 3 words. It is very, it's funny.
No.
Okay. Movie. It doesn't matter what it is. Can any movie name the production company or the studio behind it? Okay? No. Now, think about your car. Do you know what kind of car you drive? Raise your hand if you don't know what kind of car you drive. Okay? So when I think of my favorite books, right, and I mentioned before The Long Tail, Chris Anderson's book, I could not tell you the publisher. So Seth Godin, who's a very influential writer, he's written 14 or 15 best-selling books, has actually started something called the Domino Project, if you haven't heard of it. And the implication being that one domino knocks over the other. So this notion that there are gatekeepers out there is eroding, and not just with books, with movies. The cost of producing a movie has dropped ridiculously. In fact, I want to say 2 years ago, a guy in Korea had a $130,000 budget for lights and filmed a proper movie with an iPhone. Right? $130,000 for a movie, that's pretty low. Radiohead, anyone ever hear of that band? Okay. Around 7-8 years ago, they realized the futility in stopping people from pirating music. So they made a decision. They used Mac Pro Tools to create very professional sounding music, and they put it on their website for free. It said, download it. We would like you to pay whatever you think it's worth. Guess how much the average person paid for that music as a download? For the whole album. $99. Well, I guess a normal album is $12. So if a normal album is $12, then most, I know a lot about music in the industry, most artists don't make very much off of that. The average person went to the site and paid voluntarily $4.32, I think, which was a bigger portion of the revenue otherwise. In, I want to say around 2000, there's sort of an obscure English band called Marillion. And I'm a big fan. I actually just interviewed the lead singer for Huffington Post, which was a real treat on Skype. And their record company in 2000 canceled the US tour. And this is just when the internet gets started. In fact, Michael Lewis brought about this when the future just happened. I think that's the name of the book. Next, the future that just happened. So the record company cancels the tour in the US. And one of the Marillion fans said, well, how much do you guys need to tour the US? And the band's going, who the hell is this guy? So, you know what, fine, we'll tell you, $60,000. So this one, I forget the fan's name, but the fan comes back and says, okay, you know, we'll get back to you. So a couple weeks later, said, just so you know, we're at 20,000. And that's when these guys from Marillion said, huh. They wound up funding the $60,000 US tour, and at that point, think about the power shift that just happened. The record company used to hold all of the cards. And now this band Marillion went back to the record company and said, we don't really need you anymore. So there was this complete power change. And actually, Marillion's continued with this model. And they did an album called Marillion.com. Before they went into the studio to record a note, they had 12,000 paid pre-orders. So I think there are massive changes there for all sorts of gatekeepers and powers that be. And it's astonishing to me how most people wouldn't even know the record company of their favorite band, right? It doesn't really matter. It's the same thing with the publisher of your book or with a movie studio. So I think that you have to get on board with that. If I were a massive publisher, I mean, look what Amazon is doing. Amazon just ponied up, I think it's $800,000 for Penny Marshall to write books. Tim Ferriss, 4-Hour Work Week, 4-Hour Diet, 4-Hour Cook, 4-Hour Body. Amazon just signed him up for some ridiculous amount of money. And if I were Tim Ferriss, I would do the same thing. Who knows their customers better than Amazon? They know exactly what you buy and they know what other people buy, so they can make those recommendations. When you get those if X then Y emails, I love those things. Why? Because Amazon is recommending to me books that I'm probably going to find interesting. It's not taking a mass market approach. It's not blasting me. It's funny, it actually works too well because I'm from New Jersey and it's the law there. You have to own a Bon Jovi CD, right? So I bought Best of Bon Jovi 10 years ago. And Amazon learned, right? So I actually had to say, stop sending me Bon Jovi stuff because it was just a one-time thing. Now, nothing against Bon Jovi, but it actually can be too good. So I think there are massive implications because, and in fact, Amazon, I don't know if you heard this, a couple of months ago, in fact, we talked about this in Anaheim, had announced plans to open a boutique bookstore, a physical store, maybe the size of this room. So yeah, I mean, we could talk for a long time about publishing, but I'll save time if we have one more question, maybe? Yeah?
I kind of want to keep on the publishing thing, but to
Okay.
talk about scholarly communication and scholarly journals.
Okay.
So you have two major companies that pretty much hold the majority of the journal population and are holding on to it so tightly. So how do you get that kind of a group to change to a platform-type environment?
I don't necessarily think they'll change because they want to. I think they'll change because they have to. In fact, funny you mentioned that. I read an article 2 or 3 months ago about how even that's being disrupted now. And there are, I think, professors and other academics that are trying to, quote unquote, self-publish their works. And they don't need the approval of a proper publisher. So I know that academia can be a little bit cliquey, and I'd be shocked if the same citations or the same papers were held in high regard if they were done by a different outfit than the main two. But I don't see how that model stays intact, right? Again, you know more about it than I do, but why everything's kind of crumbling, right? There are people now, and you couldn't do this 5, 10 years ago, who are basically getting all of their content, maybe except for sports, without cable, right? I mean, this disruption that's happening is absolutely, I don't want to say unprecedented, but I think the speed is unprecedented, right? We see things go viral so quickly now. It's hard for me to imagine that anything is really going to be the same 10 years from now. There are people who want it to stay the same, But when I think, and I'll kind of sum up here, which is some general thoughts about libraries, if people still conceive of libraries as places to get books, then how do you compete with Amazon, right? I can buy, for less than the cost, when I bought that Michael Lewis book Next, it's a little bit dated, it's about 10 years old. I think I paid with Amazon Prime $2 for a used version of it. Love the book. My time and my gas to find that at a library, crossing my fingers hoping they have it, or trying to navigate in Nevada, seeing which library had it and when they can get it in their library alone. So to me, I don't need to go to libraries to get books, but are there other things that I could do? Because I think two things that libraries have going for them are A, trust, and B, physical space. So if a library is more sort of broadly thought of as a place to facilitate learning, then why couldn't there be courses, right? Why couldn't authors do readings? Why couldn't, yes, you maybe have some books there, but I don't necessarily see that as the primary function of a library. Now, that probably flies in the face of a lot of conventional wisdom and a lot of people who spent the last 2 or 3 decades working at libraries. But without getting all political here, I don't see funding for libraries increasing. In fact, I talked about this last time. There is a proposition now in Henderson, Nevada, where I live, just a little bit from Vegas, on giving all libraries, I think it's extra $100 per taxpayer. Maybe it passes, maybe it doesn't. But to me, it's almost a matter of trying to prolong a model that I don't want to say isn't working anymore, but the libraries pre-Google and post-Google, to me, have to react. You don't ignore that. And the same thing with Scholar. I don't see how one area is protected. So, are we good? Okay. Well, I'll sign some books in about an hour, but thank you all for your time.